Hey folks, one of the things we need to do to prepare for the AP exam is to understand these things about language. Here's an objective about language that works for our studies. Let me get back to that, sorry. We need to synthesize how biological, cognitive, and cultural factors converge to facilitate language acquisition, development, and usage. It's a fancy way of saying understand where language comes from, how we learn it, how we use it, how culture and thinking affect it, how language affects those things in turn, that sort of thing. So to get us started, we need to know the very basics of language. And this isn't the most exciting thing that we study, but it does pop up on the AP exam once in a while. The basic structure of a spoken language especially. A lot of these things apply to sign language, non-spoken language, but particularly with spoken language, you do need to know these concepts and terms and how they make spoken language a thing. So all spoken language consists of these basic things in blue here on the screen. Let's start with phonemes. A couple weird words here we got to make sense of. Phonemes are the smallest units of sound in a spoken language. Okay? All spoken languages are made up of sounds, obviously, and the smallest sounds that have no meaning are called phonemes. Think about the word phone as in phonics, or like telephone. What do we hear on a telephone? We hear sounds. So phonemes are just sounds with no meaning whatsoever. We'll come back to that in a second. Let's go to morphemes, another weird word, but spoken languages are also made up of morphemes. These are also small units of sound, but morphemes have meaning. Here we go again with a Rider mnemonic. Ready? Morphemes have meaning. Phonemes do not. Phonemes are sounds that make up a language, but those sounds have no meaning. If you put a couple phonemes together, you can create morphemes, though. These are sounds that do have meaning. So words, all words are morphemes, okay? Cat is a morpheme. It's a sound. Cat is a sound. How about this, though? Ka, ka. That's a phoneme. The sound ka is a phoneme because that sound doesn't have any meaning in the English language. So in English anyway, ka is a phoneme. And as you can see here, the sound t is a phoneme. T. Now don't get hung up on the letter. We're talking sounds, okay? Letters represent sounds, and we're talking all about sounds here. So t is a phoneme, and ka is a phoneme. But if you put those two phonemes together, cat is a morpheme, because that unit of sound has meaning. Okay? Now, not all morphemes are words. It can go smaller than words, like suffixes, ed, the representing the letters ed. If we put that like I walked, I walked, that last sound, d, means I walked in the past tense. Okay? That sound, d, is a morpheme. I know this is really strange, right? These are the units of sound that make up spoken language. Okay, so then we go on to grammar rules. And you guys can let me know if you have any questions about this, but that's really the basics. These are both small units of sounds. Phonemes have no meaning by themselves, but morphemes do. If you add a morpheme to a word, it's going to change the meaning. Like, sorry, 1 second. And this is always very confusing for people, so I feel like I shouldn't move on yet. S is a morpheme. S. I have pencil. I have pencil. S. Adding that s at the end of pencil changes the meaning. Now I have multiple pencils instead of one pencil. Okay? Again, let me know if you have questions or problems. Let's go on to grammar. As I said, grammar is the system of rules in a language that enables us to communicate with others and understand other people. But we can break that down a little bit further. The rules themselves that make up grammar are called syntax. Syntax is the rules for combining words in such a way that they'll make sense together. Okay, in English, what is it? I gotta channel my English knowledge here, like my grammar knowledge. Don't tell Miss Matu I'm taking a second to think about this. But we would say in English, oh, there's a red car, right? Red car, adjective first, then the noun. The adjective describes the noun. So red car, the red car drove past me. But in other languages, the syntax is different. There are different rules. I think in Spanish, you would say the car red or the car of red. The adjective would follow the noun. Syntax pertains to the rules of language. We'll see some examples here in a second. Semantics, though, deals with the meaning of the words, the language we're using. It's a set of rules, sure, but the rules in semantics affect the meaning of what we're saying. And I think I've got an example here for you on the next slide. When we're dealing with the surface structure of language, it's different than when we deal with a deep structure. Okay, this is all from Noam Chomsky. There's a name for you. Noam, N-O-A-M, Chomsky. This guy's a psycholinguist. He's the biggest name in modern linguistics. You need to recognize his name, of course. We'll get more into his basic theories in a minute, but he acknowledges in his research and theories that there's surface structure of whatever's said. That's the actual words, the symbols, the signs, the phonemes, the morphemes that we choose to use when we put a sentence together. The deep structure, though, has to do with the semantics, the meaning of what's being said. So take a look at some of these statements down here, these silly little like flaws in grammar potentially. You've got this like name of a movie, Jack the Giant Killer. Well, grammatically, we have to wonder, is Jack the killer of giants, or is Jack a giant-sized killer himself? Maybe we need a hyphen if we're writing this, giant killer, or something like that. How about a stolen painting found by tree? So given the syntax there, like there's nothing really wrong with that. This is fine. There's a stolen painting that's found near a tree. But if we changed the wording, if we changed the surface structure of the sentence, it might make more sense semantically in a deep surface way. If we said stolen painting found near tree, just by changing the surface structure, the word that I choose there, I could clarify the deep structure, the meaning of what's being said. Just like safety experts say school bus passengers should be belted. Belted? That's an interesting word. Does that mean they need to be strapped in with a seatbelt, or they need to be hit with a belt? Changing the surface structure sometimes can clarify the meaning. But again, if we say safety experts say school bus passengers should use seatbelts, we've changed the surface structure of that sentence, but we haven't changed the deep structure, as long as we were thinking about seatbelts originally. Okay? But here's an example of changing the surface structure, changing the morpheme, the word that we use there, can clarify the deep structure of that sentence. I'm going to jump ahead here a couple of slides. Bear with me. Okay, so now we need to get into some theories about where language comes from. How do we acquire language? Well, just a quick recap. B.F. Skinner had some theories. Remember him from operant conditioning, operant learning theory. Skinner believed that we learn language the same way we learn everything, through operant conditioning, basically. That little babies will babble. There's something might be wrong with that baby, just saying. But if the baby's babbling and comes across some random sound, right? And if people start flipping out in the room and cheering for the baby and hugging and kissing the baby because he made this random sound, mama, then that baby's going to keep repeating that sound because he's been positively reinforced for doing so. In a very quick explanation, that's Skinner's way of explaining where language comes from. We also have guys, they're not mentioned on this slide, but Albert Bandura would agree with this part of the theory, right? Social learning theory. Bandura might have explained that we learn language by watching and listening to other people talk around us, picking up on their habits and mimicking them, especially if we hear somebody say something, we see them get reinforced for saying it. Mom, can I have a cookie, please? My older brother says that. I see mom bring him a cookie. I'm like, oh, mama, can I have a cookie, please? If I say please, just like my brother did, maybe I get the cookie too, right? Vicarious reinforcement. Observational learning could have something to do with how we learn language as well. Let me jump ahead just one slide. I want to come back to Noam Chomsky because that's huge. But since we're talking Bandura, I'm going to go ahead a little bit and let's also talk about linguistic determinism for a second, because this is a pretty heavy idea. A guy named Benjamin Whorf came up with this idea of linguistic determinism. Linguistic means using language. Determinism means that it's causing something, it's affecting something directly. So language is affecting something. And what Whorf believed was that the way people talk actually affects, determines, and even reflects the way those people think. Okay? The way we talk determines the way we think, and vice versa. You can see the visual down here. Look at this. We got thinking up here and language down here, and arrows going around reciprocating with each other. So what we think leads to what we say, and how we talk feeds back and affects how we think about things. It's like, according to Whorf, this is where culture comes into play, right? If you live in a certain area of the world where it never snows, like you live in the, I don't know, sub-Saharan desert or something, I think it never snows there. Well, you probably don't have a word for snow. Think about it. It's a simple idea, but think about that for a second. If you've never experienced snow in your life, you're not going to have a word for it. Because Whorf says you've never had to think about that white, fluffy form of precipitation. If you've never had to think about it, then you've never had to make a word for it, and therefore you can't even talk about it. Because you can't talk about it, you can't form a thought about it. It's not possible to think about something that you can't talk about, according to Whorf, and vice versa. Okay? That's linguistic determinism, a sign that our cultural experience has a great effect on how we use language. Whatever we learn from where we live, who we interact with, the things that we're taught to value, the things that we happen to experience in our lives, those are the things that we're going to be capable of thinking about. And therefore, those are the things we're going to be capable of talking about. Again, Whorf would say, if we can't talk about something, if we don't have a word for something, then we're not capable of thinking about it, and vice versa. Linguistic determinism. Okay? If that's really heavy and confusing, let me kind of bring up a controversial topic very quickly, one that you've all heard about and maybe you've thought is ridiculous. And you don't have to agree with this, but at least consider this argument from Whorf's point of view. Whorf would suggest that there are people on the right track, people who believe that there are folks in our society who have been discriminated against, people who have been oppressed. And if a person thinks, if a group thinks that oppressed people need more rights, then those people might push for us to use language very differently. Example, people who believe that homosexuals deserve more rights have been pushing for a long time for people to stop using the word gay as an insult or, a disparaging term. Like if you see a movie you don't like, you say, I saw that movie last night. That movie was gay. Well, gay rights activists have been saying for years, we need to stop that. We need to stop using the word gay as if it's an insult, like it's a synonym for something bad, something we don't like. Because whether you realize it or not, if you're using the word gay as a synonym for bad or stupid or lame, they argue, then you're thinking and saying that gay people are in turn stupid, lame, bad. And anybody fighting for gay rights doesn't want people to think that way about gay people. They want them to be seen as people deserving of equal rights like anyone else. So I know that's a controversial topic, but think about that through the lens of linguistic determinism. The idea there is behind that argument that if we change the way we talk, in this case, about homosexual people, if we change the way we talk about them, we will in turn change the way we think about them. If we stop using the word gay as an insult or a synonym for stupid, if we stop saying it that way, then maybe we'll stop thinking about gay people as being inferior or less than or not deserving of equal rights or something like that. Okay, it's linguistic determinism. Now let's jump back to Noam Chomsky, possibly the weirdest name in all psychology. Sorry, that's judgmental on my part, and I'm a big jerk. Anyway, Noam Chomsky. Just for that, I'm going to name my next child Noam. Gnome Rider. Nope, that's no good. That sounds like somebody who rides little elves, like for sport. Gnome Rider. Not happening. Sorry, Mr. Chomsky. Okay, so we're back to this idea. Where does language come from? Skinner said, operant conditioning. Worf said, comes from our culture, comes from our experience based on what we're taught to think about. That affects where language comes from and vice versa, as I said. Now here comes Noam Chomsky, who believes that we all have language abilities born into us at birth, that our brains come hardwired with language abilities, sometimes called the inborn universal grammar theory. More often, I see this as being referred to as a language acquisition device, here in red. Noam Chomsky believed that we're all born with a language acquisition device. Chomsky's a fine lad, don't you think? Lad, L-A-D? Dumb, but if it helps, whatever. Language acquisition device is just a fancy way of saying that when we're born, there's something in our brains, some kind of neurological predisposition, a setup to acquire language. Maybe it's Wernicke's area and Broca's area. Maybe that's what Chomsky was getting at. Maybe we're born with Wernicke's and Broca's areas already there, waiting to accept language, just waiting to learn language, but we're born ready for that learning. Let me give you one reason to think that Chomsky is right here. There's a lot of reasons based on his research, but let me give you just one. Here is what research shows us is a common stage reality of how children develop with language. I believe this is based on Chomsky's own research cross-culturally. That means Chomsky and people like him, they traveled around the world and studied language development in children of many different cultures. And what they found was this basic stage was followed. Okay, now think about that for a second. Whenever cross-cultural research is done like this, and the findings are the same, no matter what culture you look at, what's that tell us? That tells us that culture does not affect language development. If the development happens the same way across every culture, the assumption is that this is driven by biology, something that all humans are born with, like a language acquisition device. Okay? So this supports Chomsky's theory that language happens in a predictable set of stages, based on brain development and experience, but this is all started because we're born with language abilities. So what Chomsky and others have noticed is the first stage of language is the babbling stage. Okay, children in the first several months of life up to the first year, they babble. They make sounds. They try to mimic what they're hearing around them. Okay, and to support Chomsky's theory, this is amazing. Are you ready? You better buckle in real quick. Wrap some duct tape around your head real fast. Are you ready for this? Deaf children who grow up around parents using sign language, the deaf children can see just fine. They babble too, but they don't babble with sounds mimicking words because they've never heard words. They don't have schemas if they're completely deaf. They don't have schemas for spoken words. So deaf babies babble with their hands. They're just babbling. So this means nothing, I hope, in sign language. I'm not making fun of sign language there. That's babbling. It's nonsense. That doesn't mean anything. But even deaf babies babble with their hands, suggesting that even deaf babies have a language acquisition device like the rest of us that's guiding their language development. As long as we're exposed to language, our brain will flourish with language learning. That's Chomsky's basic theory. Think of the language acquisition device as being like a seed for language in the brain. And as long as we're stimulated with language, that's like getting water and nutrients and sunlight to the seed, then that seed grows and flourishes and we learn language just fine. Okay, the next step that is found all around the world, around a year of age, children start using one-word sentences. It's not even sentences per se, but they use one word to get their point across. Little baby who goes up, up, that's one word, but that baby's conveying, mother, father, someone, please lift me off this ground. I'm exhausted and I'm tired of walking. I've just learned how and I'm exhausted. Carry me for a time, won't you? He gets that whole idea across in up, up. This is called hollow phrasing, okay? Holophrastic speech, hollow phrasing is when a child, an infant, toddler, uses one word to get their point across. This is the second stage of language development after babbling. Now, around age 2, the child is going to progress to two-word speech. This is also known as telegraphic speech, like somebody sending a telegraph, or telegram, we don't even have a concept for, but you would use as few words as possible just to get your point across. It might be, send money, right? To get the whole point across. Hey, I'm broke. I need you to send me money. You can get that across in send money. That's telegraphic speech, two-word speech. And 2-year-old children tend to do this. If a 2-year-old says, Daddy cup, Daddy cup, I'm not trying to be the creepy old man pretending to be a toddler, but it's happening. So just let it happen, okay? Daddy cup is sort of a way for that kid to say, Father, I'm parched. Please bring me my chalice so that I may drink. Daddy cup gets his point across in 2 words, right? This is so weird not having you guys here to give me feedback on my stupid jokes and imitations and stuff, just talking to my laptop alone in my basement with Hogwarts in the background. Just weird. Sorry. Okay. Telegraphic speech. That's around age 2. Now, sometime in that second year, what the researchers have discovered is the child will expand beyond 2-word speech. But there is no 3-word speech. There's not a 4-word stage. The kid goes from 2 words, mommy go, mommy go, means, did my mother leave? Did she depart the premises sometime when I was not paying attention? Child gets that point across in 2 words back here in the telegraphic stage, right? Mommy go. Eventually, in that second year, that child is going to use more complete sentences. Did mommy go? Where did mommy go? Okay, there's not a 3-word or a 4-word. There's not a 3 or 4-word stage. The kid goes to speaking whole sentences. But Chomsky discovered, they're not speaking with perfection. They still have learning to do. They have to fine tune the child, their grammar usage. They have to fine tune their skills, even though they've progressed to using full sentences. Here are some ways that Chomsky discovered that children tend to make mistakes. You have overextensions and underextensions. And look, we talked about some of this back with operant conditioning, with stimulus generalization and response generalization and all that. Here's the most important thing for you to know. Here's what pops up on AP exams once in a while. It's in red here. It's a super important idea. It's called over-regularization. There's a mouthful of a term. Over-regularization. Okay? Over-regularization is sometimes also called overgeneralization. Not to be confused with other kinds of generalization, just keep that in mind. Overgeneralization is a synonym for over-regularization. Have I ever told you psychologists are jerks? They make up different names for the same daggone thing. Here's another one. Overgeneralization or over-regularization mean the same thing. And it's not what you think at first. It sounds like overgeneralization. The kid says, bring me the cup when it's really a glass, not just like, that's not overgeneralization. This is. Let me back up. I hope I'm saying the English stuff right. Again, don't call Miss Matu on me if I get this wrong. But there's regular verbs and there's irregular verbs. Let me give you some regular verbs. Walk, jump. There should be so many coming to my mind. But there's a couple. Walk, jump, skip. I don't know why all of my verbs right now have to do with, ambulating, but those are regular verbs. What makes them regular is that you can just put an ed on the end of them and make them past tense. Walk becomes walked. Jump, jumped. Skip, skipped. Okay, that's a regular verb. You just put ed on the end and that makes it past tense. So can you guess what an irregular verb is? Your hint is on the screen, of course. An irregular verb is one that you can't just put ed on the end, at least not if you're following syntax rules of your language, okay, of English in this case. So go is an irregular verb. If you want to make it past tense, you have to change it to a completely different word. Went. I go to the store? No. I went to the store. Go is an irregular verb. So what do children do even when they're, advancing to full sentences, they're past telegraphic speech? They say things like this. I goed to the store and I sitted in the cart and mommy pushed me around. Push, that's a regular verb. Pushed, mommy pushed the cart that I was in. And I seed all the people there wearing masks at the store because of the coronavirus. I seed them. They were wearing masks. No, dummy, you saw them. See is an irregular verb. You have to turn it to saw to make it past tense. Learn your language. Sorry, don't really talk to children that way, please. Because what Chomsky believed himself is that even though this is a mistake, this is over-regularization, right? Treating an irregular verb like it's regular. I swimmed at the pool and I drinked Kool-Aid when I swimmed there. You seed me, right? Dumb kid. Anyway, what Chomsky believed is that this is okay. This is the kid learning grammar rules. He just hasn't perfected it yet. It's a normal part of language development. The more education that kid gets, the more stimulation that kid gets, the more that flower of language is going to flourish and, become more perfected over time. Okay? So that's Chomsky in a nutshell. Big nutshell that time, but that's Chomsky and his language acquisition device, okay? Inborn universal grammar. This all just means, according to Chomsky, that we're all born with a hardwired brain ready to learn language and to flourish with language stimulation. But there is one last thing to say about that. One last thing. And that is, we see some interesting things here. Excuse me. This part here I want you to pay close attention to. This thing called a sensitive period. This could also be called a critical period. Chomsky and other researchers have discovered that there is a critical period for learning language. So this is an addition to Chomsky's theory of the language acquisition device. Very, very important. Remember, Chomsky says we're born with language abilities ready to flourish in the brain. All we need is stimulation. Well, if we don't get that stimulation in the first 7 years of life, then we're kind of SOL, sand out of luck is what that stands for. Sand out of luck. That's a terrible way of putting it. Let me remind you what a critical period is, also referred to as a sensitive period, okay? A critical period is a time period. This part's very important. You had some vocab on this. Make sure you're caught up here with your notes and everything. A critical period is a time period. It's like a window of opportunity, okay? So the window is open during the critical period. Imagine this metaphorical window being in our brains, okay? And the window is open, allowing stimuli from the environment to come in the window and affect our brain and affect our development, okay? The critical period is that time period when the window is open, allowing for the stimulation to affect us. But the idea of a critical period is that over time, the window's going to shut at least most of the way, if not the whole way. And if that window of opportunity closes at age 7 or age 12 or whatever the age is, what that means is the window of opportunity shut, and now the same stimuli from the environment doesn't make it into the brain. It's not going to affect the brain the same way that it would have when the window was open, when the critical period existed. Okay? So research shows us that if a child is not exposed to language in a meaningful way for the first 7 years of life, then when that child is taught language later in life, they are very, very limited in what they can learn because their window of opportunity, their critical period for learning language, has ended. So they're never going to learn language as well as they could have when they were at a very young age. And I'll give you a very quick idea of one infamous, terrible story of a young lady. She's not the only person in history to have an experience like she did, but this is one of the reasons we know this. These are pictures of a girl who was known as Jeannie. Jeannie was neglected and abused by her parents. She was discovered in 1970 in Los Angeles. Man, there's so much to the story, and it's a terrible, awful, awful story of child abuse and neglect. But if there's any silver lining at all, and it's terrible to think of it that way, I know, it's that psychologists learned so much about language theories and language development by doing case studies on Jeannie, by studying what she was like, what she could learn, what she was capable of, even after her abuse and after she was rescued and nurtured and taught. Terrible, awful, sad story. Maybe we can get more into her story after the AP exam's over, but a very, very brief overview of Jeannie's story. For the first 11 or so years of her life, 11 or 13 years of her life, she was kept at her parents' house. Her parents, she had a very abusive and alcoholic father and a brother and a mother who were also victims of the father's abuse. Jeannie may have been born with some mental disabilities. I'm trying to tell this in a very shortened way just so you get the main idea because I don't want the video section to be very long here, but awful but fascinating story. Jeannie, who was maybe born with mental disabilities, it's believed that her father was so frustrated with her by the time she was 2, she wasn't taking the potty training, she may have already had mental disabilities. He decided that the family was not allowed to care for Jeannie, that they weren't to waste their time on her. Awful, awful to think about. But he basically imprisoned Jeannie in her bedroom with practically no toys, no stimulation, blind closed on the window. The family was forbidden, the mom, the brother, forbidden from talking to her. They would get beaten if they were talking to her, playing with her. They were allowed to bring her like food and water just to keep her alive. It got to a point where they tied her to a little potty chair, a little trainer, like plastic trainer toilet. Instead of changing her diapers, they just like roped her down onto a potty chair. It's awful to even think about. Sorry. I didn't think I'd get choked up talking about this. Sorry. But this is how Jeannie was kept at her own house for the first like 11 or 13 years of her life. She's discovered and rescued and taken to Children's Hospital in Los Angeles in 1970, where psychologists basically care for her and try to teach her language and other skills and things simultaneously. Now, there's lots of ethical problems and issues that come up there because these people who were studying her were also like acting as her caregivers. She was technically property of the state. She was living at the hospital, and these psychologists were basically, they were falling in love with her. I mean, she's a young child. They care for her. They sympathize with her. There ends up being a terrible custody battle. Some of the same psychologists who were studying her wanted to adopt her, and there were claims of, well, you just want to adopt her so you can study her all yourself and write the book and the movie and make all the money about her. Awful, terrible stuff. But again, the very, very short version of her story is that Jeannie, rescued around, I forget if it was age 11 or 13, the big question was she past her critical period? Could she learn language even that late into childhood? Aside from all the, other aspects of her story, that was one of the things that psychologists were most interested about learning from Jeannie and her terrible, terrible situation. And again, the very short story is Jeannie did learn words. She learned lots of words, and that was a huge surprise. She never spoke totally normally. And the bad news is she never fully learned grammar. She never learned the difference between, say, okay, for example, she could say doll. She could find a doll in the room. If you had a bunch of objects in a room, you said, Jeannie, go get the doll. She could distinguish what the doll was, pick it up and bring it over. She understood that word. She did learn a lot of words. She knew the word shoe. Jeannie, can you find the shoe in the room? Yes, she get the shoe, bring it back, shoe, doll. But here was the problem. No matter how much they tried, they could not get Jeannie to understand the difference between put the doll on the shoe versus put the shoe on the doll. Imagine what you would do if there was a shoe and a doll in front of you. There's a big difference between put the doll on the shoe versus put the shoe on the doll. Jeannie could not apparently distinguish the difference between those two sentences. She was not learning semantics. She could not learn syntax. So from that research, it supported the idea that Jeannie, like all people, probably had a critical period for learning language. And because of the terrible abuse that she endured for the first 11 or 13 years of her life, her window of opportunity, her critical period, or maybe it's a sensitive period. Maybe it's not totally critical. Maybe it's a sensitive period for learning language. Jeannie's was over. Her window of opportunity for learning language, that window was mostly shut. So she could learn words, but she was never able to learn language in a meaningful way, semantically, and with the grammar rules. And look, using language is a lot more than just saying words. It really matters how you string those words together and which words you can use and how you use them and so forth. Now, last thing I'll say before I end this, you might be thinking right now, Mr. Ryder, like why do we learn second or third languages in high school? I'm taking Spanish 2 right now. You mean I should have taken it when I was 5 or 6? I would have been a lot better? Well, hold on. First, yeah, if you learn a second or third language in early childhood, it is going to be easier for you to learn. Especially think about what we've learned about the brain and neurons and synaptogenesis. If you're learning a new language when you're 3 or 4 and your brain can create new synapses and networks in response to that new language, that's amazing. That's going to help you learn the language so much more. Right now at age 16, 17, 18, whatever, or I'm 45, I could learn another language. It's just going to be harder for me because my old man brain is not creating new synapses to the extent that it was when I was 4 or 5 years old. My brain isn't as plastic now as it was when I was a little kid. Okay, but I can still learn a new language even past age 7. Why? Because I was stimulated by language in my critical period. I was exposed to language meaningfully in the first 7 years of my life. So my brain has flourished with language abilities, and I've got the foundation to learn other languages throughout my life. Okay? The problem is with, hence the Harry Potter background, if you stick a kid in a cupboard for the first 7 years of his life, and then he comes out on his 8th birthday, and you want to try to teach him language then, it's too late, Jack. He's not going to learn language at least as well as he could have if you would have taken advantage of his critical period, that window of opportunity for learning language in the first 7 years of life. Thanks, everybody. Sorry I got choked up talking about Genie. I hate the idea of kids being mistreated.